All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. The trolls under the bridge, intersubjective parasitology, computational demonology, and things that go bump in the dark night of the soul with the one and only Evan McMullen. And this is a Philosopher-in-Residence series. This is part 3. And we've been tracking this thing that Evan has been calling intersubjective parasites. And today, Evan's going to provide a taxonomy of these entities. So buckle up for that and how it's going to work. I'm going to take in Evan in a moment. He's going to present, and then we'll pivot to Q&A. So if you have questions anytime about what comes up today, or perhaps something that came up previously, pop them in the chat and I'll call on you. You can ask your question to Evan, and then this will be on YouTube. So keep that in mind. That being said, Evan, welcome back, my friend.
All right, thanks. Can everybody hear me all right? All right, cool. Yeah, I'm in a slightly different setup. Have been a slightly different place today. The backdrop is unfamiliar. The tech is a little bit new. So I'm glad everybody can see and hear me. Today we're going to start discussing the proposed taxonomy of these intersubjective entities. And I'm going to take us through a specific example of one thing I think I've identified. And then we're going to basically have a sort of discussion based on that, and then move into a audience participation discussion type thing. And then we'll be spending a good portion of next week as well, sort of laying out my take on the sort of complete's a strange word, but the actual the best taxonomy I've got so far. So I wanted to do a worked example of how I'm looking at the taxonomy here today and see how people respond to that. I might be totally wrong about this. And before I lay out a sort of canonical taxonomy of how I think this works, I wanted to take everybody through one worked example, discuss that with the group, and then go from there, because I view this as an intersubjective collaborative process in figuring this stuff out together. And the Stoa community has been invaluable in this effort so far. And so I'm very grateful for the contributions of everyone. So I'll go ahead and get started sharing my screen. Give me 1 second here, and let's start this slideshow and see if this works. Oh, come on now, something happened. Slideshow. Okay, so let's try sharing screen now. There's session 3, and if I hit slideshow start, you guys see full screen now? Okay, again, sorry for the tech issues. So before we get started, I would like to, like I did last time, I did a dedication for the session. I'd like to dedicate this session to my friend and co-worker and colleague, Shawana Vaughn, the founder and president of Silent Cry, which is a organization working in carceral justice reform. She is currently in the hospital. I've been working through this situation with her. And so if everybody who is willing to and has some sort of practice of prayer or metta or sending good vibes or whatever feels like they might want to send her some positive energy, that would be greatly appreciated. She's doing great work in this area, and I want to dedicate this session to her. So with that being said, moving into the content of the session. So we're going to be taking a look today at what I'm calling a phylomimetic taxonomy of intersubjective entities. So phylomimetic, what's that? Well, this is by analogy to phylogenetic classification, as in a phylogenetic tree in the classification of organisms. So a phylogenetic tree is a classification of physical organisms along the lines of a shared genetic lineage. And so we're going to be classifying mimetic organisms, so intersubjective entities, along the terms of a shared mimetic lineage. That is the goal, anyway. And so from one perspective, there are as many kinds of entities of this category as there are individuals. Each of us probably carries around unique mimetic instances. So what I mean by this is, well, we're all classifiable as human beings based on our genetics, and yet each of us has a unique genome. So similarly, each of us has a unique memome and probably carries around in some sense unique instances of these entities, and yet that's sort of in the subjective frame. In the intersubjective frame, we can see that there are probably only a few major phyla of entities which end up creating most of the observable effects that I was discussing in the previous sessions. So my perspective here is that when we're following lines of mimetic descent, it probably makes sense to follow the lines of language and culture, since those are, in fact, as far as I can tell, the primary means or vector of intersubjective cultural transmission, of mimetic transmission. So going on to our next slide. So just to outline here some of the major linguistic and cultural lines, which I find to be relevant for this sort of analysis, are the Indo-European line, first of all. So I'm speaking English, which is an Indo-European language. So we talk about an Indo-European culture, an Indo-European language. It appears that all of the Indo-European languages descend from a common ancestor, sometime, depending on who you ask, between 8 and 20,000 years ago. There was probably a cultural group in Central Asia, Central Eurasia, that we spoke a language that we've sort of reconstructed linguistically through historical linguistics and called Proto-Indo-European. So I mentioned some of these languages, Greek, Latin, English, German, basically all of the European languages, with very few exceptions like Finnish and Hungarian and Basque are Indo-European languages. And so when we look at these, it's not just the languages that are similar and come from a similar cultural lineage. It is also in their mythologies, their mythological structures. So the thing I want to call attention to for the purposes of this session is something called a titanomachia. So this is a term taken from Greek mythology, though you see similar mythological dynamics in other Indo-European mythologies, like Germanic mythology, including the Norse mythology and the Old German mythology. As well as in the Vedic mythology and in the Zoroastrian mythology, which are from the eastern branch of the Indo-European cultural lineage. And so I specifically want to draw attention to the titanomachia because there are 2 or more iterations of the pantheon of gods. And this seems to me to be something like the cultural memory of the invention of war. So we're going to return to this later for, in fact, the bulk of the content that I'm presenting in this session. I would like to mention a couple of the other linguistic and cultural lines that I have been looking at in this project. And so we've got the Semitic language family and cultural lineage. So Semitic languages include Hebrew, Arabic, Ge'ez, Akkadian, Babylonian, notably not Sumerian, which is a fascinating topic we'll get to probably in the next session, though it might come up today as well. And so Semitic mythologies as well have a sort of common cultural core to them, where you see, for example, flood myths in most Semitic mythologies, as well as myths involving towers and their destruction. These are pretty common tropes in different Semitic mythologies. And then finally, the Sino-Tibetan cultural sphere and language family. So this are speakers of Sino-Tibetan languages: Mandarin, Cantonese, Tibetan, Vietnamese, Thai. There's a whole bunch of Sino-Tibetan languages. And again, they have a sort of shared cultural memory, cultural history component to them. So again, today we're going to be focusing on the Indo-European cultural sphere and mimetic lineage. So it is not clear to me, actually, and this is maybe a sort of controversial statement, but part of the core conclusion that I've come to over the past few years of researching this topic is that it's not clear the extent to which we can even extract a certain intersubjective parasite from the concept of Indo-European culture as a whole. So that's a pretty big statement, and we'll get to some of the reasons that I believe that as the session goes on. So specifically, something related to this vampire archetype, which I discussed last session seems to be somewhere in the neighborhood of a core structural feature of the Indo-European cultural groups at some level, to varying degrees in different times and places. And one way of looking at this is that it tends to come, I think, from the fact that most societies of Indo-European speakers, including, as far as we can tell, the sort of Proto-Indo-Europeans from which the whole cultural lineage sprang, they had a fairly explicit caste system, right? So the classic caste system is the 4+1 part Varna system in Vedic culture. So if people are not familiar with this, this is basically a caste system in which there are 4 castes and then one group which is literally outcast, as in they're often referred to as untouchables. So the highest caste is the Brahmanical or priestly caste, the religious leadership caste, scholarly caste. Then you have the Kshatriya caste, which includes the rulers and warriors, like the kings and warriors, essentially. Shakyamuni Buddha came from a Kshatriya family. Then you have the Vaishya caste, which is the merchants and skilled artisans. And then you have the Shudra caste, which is the sort of unskilled laborers and sort of servant type service workers. And then outside of that caste system is the group often called the untouchables or the Dalits. And so this is there's a lot of different ways that caste plays out in modern Indian cultural spheres, but more or less this is sort of the prototype, is what they call the Varna system. And so I want to point out that the division of people into hereditary castes is really, as far as we can tell, quite economically inefficient. And so this seems to me to be the sort of symptom you'd be looking for when trying to diagnose a sort of intersubjective parasite interacting with a culture. So we'll go and look at some more of the details of this model. So it appears again to me that this social form of a caste system shares similar disadvantages as the form of chattel slavery employed in the American South. There's a lot of papers you can look up on this topic. I can provide some references that we can include in the YouTube recording if people are interested. And it's clearly, it's not even economically efficient to do this sort of slavery, and it's for similar reasons not economically efficient to have a rigid caste structure that determines the degree to which different people can take different jobs, essentially, fulfill different roles in society in a way that has essentially nothing to do with the individual talents of those people. So human capacities appear to vary just way too much over even a single generation within the same family to justify this kind of system as a logical and rational way of allocating human capital to, which is a term I don't really like, but for these purposes, human capital to fulfill various roles in the society. So again, something strange seems to be going on here to me. Why would such a form stick around so long and be so durable if it wasn't selected for in some way? So we're going to get into some of the ways in which I think this was selected for and how this relates to the phenomenon that I've described as intersubjective parasites. So in order to do that, I want us to think about war as a social technology. So this concept is not original to me. Many other thinkers have talked about it, but I think it's a really important frame for looking at this situation. So we're going to define war as a social technology, which allows you to cause the participation of many people in organized violence in which they have no personal interest. Now, this is the critical thing that distinguishes war from other forms of organized violence. As far as we can tell from the archaeological record, there has been organized violence in humans as long as there have been humans. But it seems that war, as I'm defining it here, is something which has basically not cropped up in every area where we've had humans for a very long time. So I'm also trying to connect this to the Indo-European sphere cultural mythologies and describe the Titanomachia as something that seems to me like a cultural memory or echo of the invention of war. So in most Indo-European mythologies, there's a battle that happened close to the beginning of everything, in which a more harmonious and nature-oriented pantheon of gods is defeated and mainly supplanted by a more aggressive, warlike set of gods with personality structures that are closer to that of what we would think of as normal modern humans. So you have the Aesir versus the Vanir in Norse mythology, the gods versus the Titans in Greek mythology, the Devas versus the Asuras in Vedic mythology, etc. So when we take a look, let's take a look at the Greek instance of this, since most people will probably be the most familiar with this. So in the beginning in Greece, in Greek mythology and the cosmogony, there was, a sort of coalescing of dualities from a sort of general non-dual undifferentiated sea, which is referred to as chaos. And so you get the original polarities like night and day, light and darkness, earth and sky, sort of coalescing out of this original chaos. And then you have emerging from this sort of fractal series of emerging dualities, you have some personality structures emerge, you have some entities emerge. And so you have all of the sort of normal pantheon of gods, of natural forces, the sort of things that very primitive humans would have found needed to be explained through mythology. So things like lightning and thunder, things like the sky and the sea and storms and growing things in the earth, and even things like memory and knowledge and wisdom that an emerging primate culture would not really be able to understand in a sort of rationalistic, mechanistic way, and would want to tell stories about in order to relate to better. So you've got Oceanus, the Titan responsible for the ocean. You've got Helios or Hyperion, the sun, the sky. You've got the moon. You've got all of these forces represented as personalities, and then you have now a generational conflict that emerges, wherein you have this new generation of gods that we later on end up referring to as the Olympians, because they live on Mount Olympus, led by Zeus. And of course, there's a prophecy, and there's all this stuff that goes on in between, which I won't bother to summarize right now. But essentially, you have the overthrow of the old pantheon by this new pantheon of gods called the Olympians. And in stark contrast to the Titans in Greek mythology, the Olympians are dysfunctional, squalid, terrible role models. I mean, Zeus and many of the other male gods go around just swooping down from heaven and basically raping everything that moves. You have the female gods, especially Hera, who seem to not really be much of the nurturing type, to put it mildly. You have Dionysus, who's this sort of weird human god hybrid, which again sort of continues this intergenerational weirdness. The gods of Olympus are incredibly incestuous in their couplings and have dubious concepts of consent, to say the least. So this is a very strange thing to have embedded in a mythology at first glance, because we already had a perfectly good set of gods that are very similar to, for example, the sorts of entities or archetypes that more indigenous cultures would relate to. Things like, you look at some of the Native American mythologies, and they seem to have something that looks like a pantheon that's a lot closer to the original Titans than the gods of Olympus. And so I find this to be fascinating, that the sort of more indigenous, the cultures that haven't really fully invented what I'm calling the social technology of war have essentially a more stable single set of gods, as far as I can tell. And then these, especially Indo-European cultures, which have definitely invented war, have this intergenerational conflict between the gods themselves. Very similarly, just briefly, in Norse mythology, the Vanir are often described as a sort of older, more indigenous pantheon of essentially nature or natural forces based gods who were almost completely destroyed and supplanted by the Aesir, the new generation of gods, which again, you look at the way that Odin and Thor and and so on behave, it's not exactly very admirable. Again, dubious consent. There's a line from one of the poems in the Poetic Edda where Thor describes to Odin, his father, how, oh, I will gladly help you hold down this woman you're trying to have your way with. So again, like very nasty stuff with this new generation of gods. Not exactly what we would in modern times think of as great role models. And then we've got the Devas versus the Asuras in the eastern part of the Indo-European cultural sphere. And I find this to be a particularly interesting example because I believe that last session, it was either towards the end of my presentation or someone asked a question. I forget the exact context, but somebody, it came up that I was asked about examples of intersubjective entities, which I thought were not parasitic, which are they all parasites? Are they all demons? Or do some of them have a more symbiotic type of relationship with the human cultures that they are sort of emerging from or interacting with? And one example I gave of something that seemed more like a symbiote was Ahura Mazda from Zoroastrianism. And I find this contrast between Zoroastrianism and the mainline Indic traditions to be especially interesting because they're essentially existing within the same cosmology. Like Ahura Mazda, well, that first word Ahura is cognate to the Vedic and Sanskrit word Asura, which is often translated as demon. And then you have the Devas, who are the sort of good gods who fight the Asuras. And then you have this Avestan side of things. Avestan is the ancient Persian language of the Zoroastrians. And they are saying, no, the Asuras are the good guys. So it's a fascinating split there where in the eastern side of the Indo-European cultural lineage, you actually end up having different groups, different subgroups that split off from each other, disagreeing about which set of gods, the old or the new, are essentially the right ones to be worshiping. The Asuras in this analogy seeming to me to be more like the Vanir, more like the Titans of Greek mythology. And in fact, the word Asura is often translated as Titan when you get to things like the Vedic six realms theory, which is used in both Buddhism and Hinduism, the hot hells, hungry ghosts, animal, human, and then Titan or demigod or demon realm, and then the god or deva realm. So long story short, this is one way of thinking about this, is that these mythologies may be a cultural memory of this Indo-European core civilization, which had invented war, encountering, conquering, and colonizing other civilizations it encountered, which hadn't effectively invented war yet. So I think this is one way to look at the core thing of the Indo-European cultural sphere, is it has in some sense achieved nearly global domination through means of this social technology called war. And there's some pretty fascinating cultural and mythological history and linguistic history involved in trying to untangle what happened here. So I don't mean to say that anything is all bad or all good, of course. So I'd like to take a second and look at some of what I would think of as variation within the Indo-European cultural sphere. So we have, like I pointed out, great similarities between the Greek mythology, the Norse mythology, and the Indic mythology with respect to things like a titanomachia, two sets of divine entities, and so on. But Greek culture is especially interesting as a sort of near counterexample to my statement that it's difficult to disentangle a certain kind of intersubjective parasite from the concept of Indo-European culture writ large. So Greek language and culture are obviously Indo-European. I mean, you can see the cognates between Greek words and Sanskrit and Avestan words. It's really obvious to any linguist that these people are speaking languages descended from the same root, and that their mythologies are descended from the same root. You've got Indra and Zeus. You've got all these parallel figures. But the Greeks were influenced really early by strong cross-pollination with the Semitic-speaking peoples, most notably the Phoenicians, who were a group of people who were very skilled sailors and explorers and spoke a Semitic language and had therefore a sort of Semitic cultural lineage and mythology. One way we can tell this is that the modern Greek alphabet originates from the Semitic alphabet via Phoenician. So you can see the evolution of, for example, the character A from like an iconograph of an ox's head through the Phoenician alphabet, which is actually quite similar to the ancient Hebrew alphabet, and then into the Greek alphabet. So the Greeks are particularly fascinating in this respect because they had two gods of war, Athena and Ares, which represent, in fact, two quite different ways of relating to organized violence. So as far as I can tell in Greek mythology, Ares represents war per se. And what I mean by this is the sort of thing that I defined in the previous slide or two as this social technology for causing people to engage in organized conflict when it is not, in fact, in their interest to do so. And so let's talk a little bit more about what I mean by that, because I'm thinking this bears some more explanation. I've talked a little bit about this in some of the previous sessions and maybe to some of the people here individually, but to be quite clear about it, there is a way of looking at the Iliad as a record of the Greeks trying and failing to invent war in a certain sense, as a sort of cultural memory of that. The very beginning of the Iliad has to do with where Achilles has basically captured some loot, including this specific woman from Troy. And the ways that the Greeks organized violence was by getting a bunch of people who had some web of relations and allegiances and kinship together in order to go and do something that was in everyone's interest, that would enhance the prestige, the wealth, the fitness, the success of all of the participants in this conflict on one side. So what this meant is that you got a bunch of guys together and they went and attacked someone else, but each of those guys got to keep what they looted themselves, basically. This was the sort of related to as normal dynamic of organized conflict, of proto-war in ancient Greece in Homeric times. And so you've got Achilles in a conflict with Agamemnon, the king of kings. He's complaining very loudly about the fact that Agamemnon has taken away his loot in the form of this woman, Briseis, and is giving him lower quality loot in terms of this other woman that Agamemnon had captured in exchange. And this is not fair. This is not right. This is not honorable according to their standards of morality and honor at the time, which were, to be clear, very different from our own, and which I'm not endorsing. But as a set of, records of cultural memory, this is a fascinating phenomenon, because then after that, the Greeks basically are unable to convince Achilles that he should just, swallow his pride and fight for Agamemnon anyway. So he and his troops, the Myrmidons, go, they basically don't go home, but they go back to their ships and chill out. And the Greeks start losing the war pretty badly. And so it's only until there is literal divine intervention to guide an arrow to kill Patroclus, to bring Achilles back into the war, that the Greeks end up winning. So they did not, in fact, successfully invent a social technology which would have allowed them to cause large groups of people to fight in a conflict and organized violence that they were not expecting to get personal benefit from. They were only able to win the conflict against the Trojans because of divine intervention. So that sort of relationship with war, where war is seen as pretty suspect. I mean, Ares was, yes, the god of war, but he was also sort of the god of psychopaths, murderers, and rapists, in the sense that if you go back to a lot of the myths surrounding Ares, he was essentially, like most of the gods, he had many mortal sons, and these mortal sons were basically what we would these days call sociopaths, psychopaths, and serial killers. And a lot of the stories about Hercules, for example, and Odysseus, and other great heroes of Greek mythology involve them going around and having to, get rid of, having to take care of, kill, murder these sons of Ares who are causing so much conflict and disruption. So basically the concept of Ares is the concept of a war god by a people who were very suspicious about war as a social technology, who were sort of resistant to it in ways that I think we can get a lens on through study of the Iliad. And then we've got Athena, who also has, as part of her portfolio, being a goddess of war. But I think this is kind of a misconception when you look at all of the myths about Athena. Athena seems to have something to do with a broader cultural search process, which, yes, sometimes involves organized conflict and organized violence, but it also involves things like currency, argument, and wisdom. Athena is also considered to be the goddess of wisdom. So when we look at some of the mythology surrounding Athena, she, of course, famously entered into a contest with Arachne to see who was the better weaver, and Arachne actually was just as good as her. And Athena, instead of smiting her and killing her, like most of the gods or goddesses of Olympus would, actually brought her back when she killed herself out of shame, when it was revealed that she was competing against Athena as a spider, and so kind of gave her a new lease on life as nature's consummate weaver. So this is a very different and more compassionate way of relating to conflict than you see from most of the other Olympian gods. Also, Athena, sort of descended from her mythologically through a kind of complicated and gross process, was this guy named Erichthonius, who is mythologically credited as the founder of Athens, who also introduced the use of the alphabet and silver coins for currency. So again, a sort of strong, harnessing the forces of competition and organized violence in a way that is pro-social and pro-civilization, rather than broadly antisocial and parasitic, as Ares represents that concept of war. And it's not quite a masculine versus feminine thing, but it's sort of close, and it has to do with a sort of gardener or nurturer kind of relationship with other people and civilization and culture versus a dominator relationship with other people and culture. So that takes us again back to the concepts of patriarchy and kyriarchy, like we discussed in the very first session of this series. So Indo-European culture is often described and criticized for being patriarchal, but I think this sort of misses the point. Kyriarchy is a term I defined in the slides for the first session, which I think is much more precise. It derives from the Greek word kyrios, which means lord or master or dominator. Someone who essentially owns slaves is a kyrios in Greek. So this is basically rule by masters, rule by slave owners, rule by dominators is what kyriarchy means. And it's used in cultural theory and critical theory to describe a sort of intersectional frame on what's going on with domination and hierarchy in society. So I think that something like kyriarchy seems to be emergent from the stratification of society inherent in the invention of war as a social technology. So what I'm getting at here is that in order to invent war as a social technology, like I said, I'm talking about war in the sense of most of the combatants in a war on a side do not have any real personal interest or incentive to be in that fight. They're not going to get richer by doing so. Their homeland is rarely actually under existential threat. It's usually a war of conquest. You can see this all the way to the present day, where enlisted people in Western militaries, let's just say that unless you're starting out at a very, very low place in the economic ladder, that is enlisting in the army is not a great way to increase your likely future earnings, because it comes with enormous risks in terms of risk for PTSD, risk for physical injury, sort of psychic risk, basically, and doesn't really pay that well compared to, just going into a skilled trade, construction, going to college, anything like that. So this phenomenon where you have essentially wars which are directed by organized violence, which is directed by targets are selected by a bunch of usually older people who have a personal financial stake in the matter, and which are actually fought by a much larger group of much younger, lower on the socioeconomic status hierarchy people, often of a substantially different ethnic makeup than the people who are in charge. This is sort of going to create, in a society which employs this social technology on a regular basis, a caste stratification of an upper class, a middle class, a lower class, very similarly to what we see in traditional Vedic Varna structure, where you're going to, over time, have information bubbles evolving, where the caste which is directing the war can communicate within itself and share models and share stories and share narratives. But there's going to need to be a sort of information theoretic security barrier around that group to avoid giving up the whole game, so to speak, because you need this group of people who are going to fight your wars for you, even though it's not really in their own economic incentive to do so. And so I think that when we look at Athena versus Ares within Greek culture, Greek mythology, there's a sort of tension here between, well, what even is war? Why might one want to engage in organized violence? And when might that organized violence be justified? When we look at the canonical weapons of Ares and Athena, Ares is a sword or a spear. It's a very, pointing at the enemy, going straight for the kill kind of weapon. And Athena's canonical weapon is the aegis, which is a shield on which is mounted the Gorgon's head, which if you look at it, it will turn you to stone, but it's not really an offensive weapon. It's a defensive, defending civilization kind of weapon. Her main thing is a shield rather than a sword or a spear. And so I think that this is, one of the consequences of having human societies in an environment of limited resources, that there's sometimes going to be conflict over resources. And so you do need to be able to coordinate among your kinship and affinity groups in order to organize violence in defense of your tribe, your community, of the commons. However, this form of organization looks a lot different than what I'm describing as the social technology of war, because in this case, everybody does in fact have a shared economic incentive to, band together and commit organized violence against those invaders. But when you look at the history of the Indo-European cultural lineage, it is in general a history of moving into new areas and engaging in conquest, colonization, and enslavement of whoever was there before. And this is, just kind of a historical fact about the Indo-European speaking groups, as compared to, for example, the, say, Sino-Tibetan speaking groups, tends to engage in far fewer wars of conquest, not necessarily fewer internal conflicts, but fewer wars of conquest, historically speaking. I think the same could be said of many other cultural groups as well. So I'm trying to sort of abstract from what I'm describing as the mainline Indo-European cultural thing, something which looks like a type of intersubjective parasite. It looks like what we call Indo-European culture has evolved, sort of co-evolved with a specific sort of intersubjective entity, which gives significant power in terms of it gives you the social technology of war. It really turbocharges the ability to cause groups of people to engage in organized violence for reasons that they are not very clear on and they don't understand and are not really in their own interest. But this is a very double-edged sword. And this is related to, say, what Scott Alexander talks about in Meditations on Moloch, I think. But I think it's not quite Moloch that I'm trying to point out here. It's something far more specific. It's sort of this core Indo-European sort of vampiric thing that gives rise to things like caste systems, things like the social technology of war. And so how does Indo-European culture get out of this? What are the good parts? I'm not just trying to dump on Indo-European culture for this session. So, well, Athena is also the sort of patron of writing, which I would describe as the premier time-binding technology. So let's talk about what I mean by time-binding here. So time binding is a term I'm getting from, among others, the sort of Alfred Korzybski style of general semantics. The idea that as humans, we need ways to pass information on intergenerationally because we are born so neotenous that we essentially have no built-in skills. A horse can run within 20, 30 minutes of being born, deer can. Cats can figure it out on their own pretty quickly after 5 or 6 weeks of being with their moms, but humans, we're helpless for a while, and we need to preserve our ability to to function in the world through intergenerational transmission, but intergenerational transmission through things like imitation of movements, pure empathy, mirror neuron stuff, and the spoken word is a pretty lossy means of information transmission across generations. So we have several ways that we have discovered or evolved to do error correction over intergenerational signal transmission. And one of these ways that is sort of the earliest, as far as I can tell, is the medium we call poetry. So when you look at things like poetry being written in a meter, say the Iliad was in dactylic hexameter, I think it is sensible to view dactylic hexameter as a technology for error correction and intergenerational transmission. Because when you know that the line here has to have this meter, it has to have a dactyl here, a spondy there, it has to be, in a certain rhythm, well then, even if you forgot the exact word, if you remember what it starts with, there's going to be a pretty limited set of words in the language that are going to fit with the meter. And so this helps do error correction over intergenerational transmission of narrative, story, models, information, knowledge in general. But it still is something that only exists within this sort of hazy intersubjective field that emerges through human interaction. It's not something you can really pin down. Spoken language is ephemeral. A copy of it exists in my brain. I speak a copy of the Iliad to you. It's got some meter to it, so maybe we can both remember it better. But over time, errors can still creep in a manner very similar to how errors will creep in the DNA and RNA transcriptase processes in genetic evolution. So you get some mutation basically happening. So we've got a newer technology, the written word, writing, which, because it is an inherently digital technology, meaning that an alphabet is a finite set of characters. Something can't be halfway in between an A or a B. It's an A or a B pretty unambiguously within a given hand or font. And so this is not binary, but it is digital. And digital technology, even analog digital technology, meaning technology that is digital but implemented by hand in an analog world, nothing like a computer, just something like an alphabet, gives you really profound error correcting capacities as a culture when you're trying to do this sort of time binding intergenerational knowledge transfer. So this sort of knowledge transfer, the written word, is what allows you and me to be in the position we are now, where we can have discussions like this, where we have a broad and deep enough knowledge of what happened in the past before we were born, with enough specifics. We all know the names of people who were born, 50, 100, 500, 1,000, 2,000 years ago, and have pretty credible reasons for believing that those people in fact existed and had lives that were structured in some kind of way that we can basically agree on. And so this knowledge, I'm arguing, is the basic substrate of our ability to notice and catalog the effects of these sorts of intersubjective parasites, as well as potentially resist the effects of these intersubjective parasites. So basically, where I'm going with this is we're going to get to what I consider to be the best taxonomic full lineage. Next week, we're going to have basically a phylomimetic tree, but I didn't want to do that until I gave this example of how I'm tracing the process through time, how I'm looking at this, and had a dialogue with the community here in order to make sure that that tree I put up is, on the right track, is taking into account the perspectives of not just me and my research, but what everyone else here has experienced and the research they've done, whether consciously or sort of subconsciously in their own lives. So let's go ahead and discuss.
What a tease for next week. Awesome. Well done, Evan. Let's give him a round of applause again for another excellent presentation. So if you have any questions, pop them in the chat. And I'm going to take people in no particular order. Let's go with David Swedlow. If you're going to unmute yourself, David.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, actually, a couple of us pointed out at the same time. Leonard Schlane's book, Alphabet versus the Goddess, and the curiosity of alphabetic language versus pictographic language, and kind of the movement towards a masculine monotheistic God versus a pantheon and feminine goddess theology. Curious about how that plays in, and if the other person who, Alexander, if you want to add anything to that question as well, you had the same basic question.
Peter, should I? Thank you, David. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Evan. Just real quick to add to what David is asking here. Part of my understanding of what Leonard Schlane is saying, one of his main points is that very provocative, that if you learn to read and write in a non-pictographic, non-iconographic linguistic-based culture, before the age of 7, you kill your relationship with the magical, mystical world. You become very analytical, very, in that sense, very what we would often associate with the masculine traits, as David is just talking about here. So, so I think part of this is also to explore, if you are holding a similar thesis, or if you look at things in a similar way, if I can, David, sort of combine what you're saying, looking at things in a similar way to the way Leonard Schlane is with relationship to the magical mystical, to the relationship between the masculine God as external and separate, or to the immanent God, who that is often seen as feminine, within, and earthbound.
So very complicated sort of set of related questions embedded in those shares. So I'll try to address them. Essentially, I'm thinking that I do enjoy Alphabet versus the Goddess, and it has influenced my thought to some degree, though I think it makes some critical mistakes. So I'll start out by describing that, and then we can go from there. I think that the separation of masculine and feminine, and the mapping of immanent God or goddess to feminine, and sort of transcendent God or goddess to masculine, is basically a mistake, and is in some sense, I think, an artifact of what I'm describing here as the intersubjective parasite with which Indo-European culture has co-evolved. And now Leonard's obviously writing from a perspective as someone who is a member of Indo-European culture, and so it's hard, and heck, so am I, right? So it's very hard to disentangle these things, essentially, is my view. But that being said, I think that, like I've mentioned in previous Stoa sessions, I think that there is a sort of third way, a sort of third path here that looks, could be described as tantric, in the sense that, say, the Tibetan Buddhists use the term tantra, in which there is a sort of non-duality between masculine and feminine, which is more characteristic of the divine than either masculine and feminine are. And you have both an immanent manifestation, a transcendent manifestation, and, if you will, an omniscient manifestation. You get things like this emerging from, say, Tibetan three-realm theory, like the three kayas theory, basically, the Dhammakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Nirmanakaya. And so the reason I'm bringing this all up is because I think that, I think I mentioned this in one of the previous sessions in this series, but if not, I'll mention it again, that there is, in some sense, the forced division in terms of masculine and feminine as having, like, obviously opposed interests, in some sense is true, and that men seem to have a slightly more R-selected reproductive strategy than women do based on biological reality. Women seem to have a slightly more K-selected reproductive strategy based on biological reality. But I think that the normal view of, like, women are from Venus, men are from Mars, the sort of really hard splitting between masculine and feminine, I think is actually a symptom of cultural infection by one of these intersubjective parasites, and not actually true of biological reality, basically. That the incentive structures for kin selection, inclusive fitness, genetic reproduction, and so on, would, if analyzed in a more reasonable way, lead to a much stronger sense of a really strong alignment between the incentives of the genders, reproductively speaking. And since most justifications for such a hard binary come from the intuitions that these these two genders would have very different sorts of reproductive strategies that would be optimal for them. I think this is basically wrong, is what I'm saying. And I think that the essential thing that's going on is that one of the ways in which, like I mentioned last session, that the intersubjective parasites create a sort of anti-mimetic field around their existence and sort of end up causing us to be fascinated and distracted by other forms of conflict. You can view the sort of war between the sexes as part of this cryptid strategy. In other words, it becomes very difficult for us to talk about the ways in which gender and sexuality differences are a relatively small part of what's going on with humans, and we have relatively little sexual dimorphism compared to many other species. And basically that we are in a situation where we seem to have a lot more conflict between gender identities and sexual identities than is really in our own interests and as a species and as a society. And so I'm identifying that itself as a symptom of this sort of intersubjective parasite. And I am trying to argue through this series that we want to take a step back from these hard binary frames of the alphabet versus the goddess, or the masculine versus the feminine, and look for the thing that is being covered up essentially by the reification of those binaries and the insistence that those binaries imply a certain kind of internal conflict between humans.
Any follow-up shares or questions, David or Alexander?
Just a quick thing, a thought on this, and it may go beyond the scope of it. If it does, feel free to punt this and we'll discuss it at a future point. But there's something that has me looking at this from a perspective of a mindset, a frame. I almost start to think that intersubjective parasite may be overly focused on the negative aspect of it, and it just an intersubjective agent or an intersubjective frame that allows for basically metabolizing chaos into order, right? And effectively that what you've pointed out here with the notion of the even the alphabet versus the goddess is already a negentropic or an entropic move towards a breakdown of the God theology. So there's something in this that is very interesting in the mode that we're as this is developing. The meaning crisis seems like it's happening at the perfect time, given a sort of an increase in entropic ability for us to be able to metabolize chaos, given the dominant frame that we have. Curious from that perspective.
Yeah, so one of the ways that I'm sort of relating to this territory is that there is a sense in which my entropy is your negentropy and vice versa. That in a reality in which we have multiple minds and agents, you could think of your waste heat as my warming campfire and vice versa, or your random babbling as my rich source of information and vice versa. Often I will be hanging out with people and they will apologize for just like babbling or, like going off on a tangent or something like that. And often the things that they somehow feel compelled to apologize for informationally are some of the things I derive the greatest value from, that give me some of the best fuel for putting together my own models and ways of relating to reality. And so I think that there's a sort of underlying dynamic here where there's a trickiness. We can't actually put a firm sign on entropy or negentropy. We can't, when you look at, say, the relationship between information theoretic entropy and thermodynamic entropy, they're basically the same equations, but sign flipped. It's kind of funny. And so you end up in this situation where randomness is just pure noise, but is also what we need to create secure communication between two minds, right? In terms of cryptography, right? I need a source of high quality randomness in order to communicate with you securely. And so that high quality randomness might be, something that somebody else views as waste heat burning off from their star or whatever, right? The random fluctuations of the quantum vacuum, what have you, there's a strange thing going on at the center of all of this, where we can, I think, relate to things from a frame that says that there are many, many more opportunities for informational gains from trade, positive sumness between minds than we are used to. And so this is how I'm trying to recontextualize a lot of the sort of binary conflicts or dualities that we see in our society, is this sense of there being a binary with a conflict between it and no possibility of gains from trade because opposed incentives and coordination problems and Moloch is actually not justified by the study of underlying physical reality. It is in some sense implanted into our intersubjectivity and cultural discourse by the things I'm calling intersubjective parasites. And so that's sort of where I'm coming to this from. So does that kind of address what you were getting at, or do you have a follow-up?
So thanks, David. Alexander, did you have a follow-up share question? No. Okay. Let's go to Christopher. Christopher, you had a question if you're still here.
Yep. Thanks, Peter. Hey, Evan.
Hey, Chris.
Hey, this might be some tangent babble. I don't know. So the question is, sort of just think about this sort of like a data. It feels like you're kind of like doing a sort of a data-driven, like effect-oriented, like detection, research exploration on like finding out what's an intersubjective parasite. So it's like makes me think about like, presumably IPs are much more sophisticated than something like a cordyceps. And so cordyceps, you wouldn't think too much about like what's driving them, what's their motivation. Like it's probably easy to just accept that they're just doing what they do to survive because cells and whatever, and Darwin or something. But so then if these IPs are, much more sophisticated, I think it becomes kind of interesting to think about the psychology of the IP. Why does it? The personality of the IP, if you will, not the people, not the group it's operating on, but the IP itself, And it starts to make me think about, you mentioned it in some of the previous presentations about like, the connection with this whole topic around like invented deities, things like that. So this becomes almost like a complex meta deity, an IP. You could think of it as some sort of like negative, wrathful, like meta Yadam or something. So yeah, any speculations on some of the personalities of some of these IPs, maybe this Indo-European IP, so on?
Yeah, so I mean, in one sense, I think this might be strictly unknowable. And what I mean by this is, we're dealing with, at that level, something that seems to me to be basically close to the definition of a complex system, something that you would want something like chaos theory to model. And so we can talk about different attractor states that things might enter into, but modeling the specific linear dynamics of this, well, it doesn't really have, it's all nonlinear dynamics all the way down. It's many, many, many moving pieces, and we have limited compute, right? Like our brains are marvels of evolution, but the things that I am positing the existence of in this series are emergent from the interactions of thousands, tens of thousands, millions, or even billions of human brains over rich, combinations of high and low bandwidth links in person and over the internet and everything. And so in one sense, to be perfectly clear about it, I think that their actual personalities, and even whether they have personalities and whether they have consciousness or a self-concept, is in some sense strictly unknowable to beings like us, in the same way that our motivations and personality structures are probably strictly unknowable to our gut bacteria. And so that being said, we are, I've been talking to people who've contacted me as a result of the first couple of sessions in this series. And one of the things that keeps coming up is, why are you modeling these things as agents? Why are you modeling them as entities, like that have motivations and goals and desires? And my basic response here is that where I'm coming from, where I'm sitting, it looks to me like agent or entity with goals and motivations and desires that has something like a mind is the sort of natural category that human minds will model something of sufficient complexity that implements some kind of control system. So something more complicated than a thermostat, but probably less complicated than the computer that you're on right now. We start modeling as a mind. We do it intuitively. I mean, I've been programming computers since I was, 4 or 5 years old at some level, and yet I still yell at them when they're not working, even though some part of me knows that they don't care, they don't have motivations, they're just dumb enchanted rocks that are executing algorithmic instructions. And yet they're complicated enough that the simplest way for me to interact with them seems to be to relate to them as having minds and personalities at some level. And I have to sort of catch myself and be like, oh, wait, no, okay, let's dive into the code. Let's see what's going on. Let's hook up the debugger. Let's hook up the process monitor and actually get to the bottom of it, because it doesn't actually hate me. It's not actually angry with me. There's something else going on. And so given that I cannot expect most people in any audience to have both the underlying training and sense of how to model things at a strict, deep information theoretic and algorithmic level, as well as the level of conscious self-control to catch themselves modeling something as a mind and then go back to modeling as a enormous complicated web of algorithms, then, well, we're humans. Let's do the human thing. Let's hang out and talk about these things as if they were agents, because I mean, all language is in some sense metaphorical. So let's use the natural metaphors that are natural for groups of humans to come together and talk about complex shit, which is to talk about it as something like an agent. And as we've progressed over our species evolution, we've learned to model things like the weather, for example, like lightning and thunder, as well. We have some equations we can throw at that. We can throw supercomputers at that, and we can know it's not actually a dude on Mount Olympus who's angry at us. There's, you know, an impersonal process going on, and this is the key word, impersonal, which is, you know, the cause of these dynamics. And so I think that at some level, my best guess here is that these are impersonal processes. But I want to caveat that by saying that I think that human selves are also impersonal processes at the very basic root level. And you know, the Buddhists have a lot to say about the way that it is a mistake, in fact, to take personally this impersonal process that is the part of your mind that generates the self. And I'm pretty on board with that kind of way of looking at things. So this is a really complicated and long-winded way of saying that on the one hand, their actual motivations, goals, and personalities, if they even have them, seem strictly unknowable. But on the other hand, we can come together in our intersubjectivity and model them as having goals or desires, so that we can tactically and strategically respond to them, because their interests and ours do not always overlap. And as we will get to in more detail next session, I do not model all of these intersubjective entities as being parasitic. Some seem symbiotic, some seem more commensal, some, you know, there's a variety of ecological relationships between these entities and individual humans and specific human cultures and societies. So we'll take a look at that in, again, more detail next time. But I do think that you know, modeling them as having at least like maybe intentions and goals isn't quite the right way to put this, since I'm trying to emphasize the impersonal nature of these processes. But certainly it appears that their reproductive fitness in whatever plane of existence is defined by existing in the substrate of human intersubjectivity and emerging from that certainly seems to involve life strategies which are optimizing for some things and not others. In other words, they seem to be embedding dynamic control systems like thermostats, but much more complicated, in the same way that our brains do. And I would imagine that some of the more complex ones probably have some sort of predictive processing or free energy minimization type thing going on in a similar way to the way that our brains do. That's super hypothetical and speculative. I don't have any hard evidence of that, but that is my current intuition.
Cool. Yeah, I think the, you know, simplified humans doing the intersubjective thing of modeling at the human level, you know, modeling as personalities, you could have, you know, Myers-Briggs for intersubjective parasites. I think that's super interesting. Yeah, I hope that maybe in your taxonomy, maybe you make some like speculative inferences or have some fun with that or something. Like, I think that'd be interesting. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Christopher. Manuel, you had a question to share.
Yes, hi, Evan. Thank you. Last time, Margaret asked the question, which was referring to what are the aggregators doing right now as we speak. And I remembered this, and the question came up for me. I remembered a talk by Patrick Ryan on the Dark Stoa, he mentioned that instead of just throwing some bankers out of some windows in the financial crisis 2008, they turned to identity politics. And I think that was maybe a sign of an egregore acting live and defending itself. And I think this perspective on what other egregores doing right now, even in this conversation, are extremely important. And yeah, I'm really curious how on your take on this. And also, I hope you received my email, because this is also part of this, what's happening right now and after this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, I did receive your email, and I do intend to get back to you. It's a very interesting possibility of dialogue here. As I mentioned at the beginning of the session, the past several days have been dominated for me personally by one of my dear friends and colleagues being very seriously injured, and just relating to the immediate on the ground needs of that. So all of my asynchronous online communication is essentially halted. This is the only thing I've plan on doing online this week, is this session. So that being said, as far as our as the topic space here goes, there's a really interesting article that might be of interest to a lot of people here if they haven't read it. It was written by a friend of mine named Ben Hoffman, and it's called The Debtors' Revolt. I'm gonna, I sent that as a direct message. So if you Google Debtors' Revolt Ben Hoffman, you will see an article that actually started out in the form of a letter to me. I'm the Dear Evan mentioned in that article. And we were discussing how there has in fact been, as far as we can tell, essentially one major world conflict going on since, well, a very long time, but that you can identify World War I and then World War II and then the 2008 recession and several other things as being essentially different manifestations or fronts of the same conflict. And I think that this is one lens to sort of examine the question space that you're suggesting here with. So in brief, to summarize a very complicated argument and article and you know, long dialogue between minds, it appears that we had this system of that had invented war, essentially, that had invented systems of stratifying humans into different castes, different classes, masters and slaves at the most simple, and 4, 5, 12, 16 castes and more complicated variations. And this had chugged along, sometimes throwing the occasional baby into the furnaces of Moloch to keep going for several thousand years until through cultural interchange with primarily the Sino-Tibetan and Semitic cultural lineages, a new system emerged. You had Leibniz studying the I Ching. You had Newton studying the sorts of gematria and other elements of encoding in the Semitic wisdom literature. And these are the same people who both invented science in a very real sense. I mean, Leibniz and Newton invented calculus at the same time. The Royal Society was getting founded. Leibniz was running the continental equivalent. And they're also coming up with things like, how do we implement joint stock corporations? How do we implement basically capitalism? And I'm not talking about capitalism as the current referent. Capitalism is currently a term which is semantically overloaded and points at way too many things to be useful, but the simple notion of, hey, we can buy shares in each other's ventures and then tie ourselves together through a shared web of incentives in order to increase the amount of value that's created for all humans, basically. And so we saw this enormous bound of technological and social progress where you see rights for minorities, rights for women, physical and material infrastructure being created essentially from whole cloth. We see just enormous prosperity emerging in the time period between the mid-1600s and the early 1900s. And at the same time, you have the old aristocracies, which were the inheritors of the old upper castes in Europe, the religious upper castes and the warrior and king upper castes, going into a series of conflicts that were called the European Wars of Religion, basically. And these monarchs got to the point where they were unable to continue fighting each other without going bankrupt, right? They ended up having to borrow enormous sums of money, of actual hard currency, from the the newly minted mercantile and capitalist classes, which made their fortunes by creating value for other people, as opposed to by threatening violence against other people. And so you have the King of England, the King of France, kings of all these countries in Europe literally being bankrupt in the sense of owing more money to this new emergent value creating class than they could possibly repay, and still being in conflict with each other and needing to finance wars. And so there was never a full accounting of those debts. Instead, we basically keep passing the buck and passing the buck and passing the buck up until around World War I. And then we have an enormous worldwide conflict, which you can view from a certain perspective as a coordinated effort by these aristocratic classes to engage in a strategy called basically coordination of default risk. So, you know, there's the old line, if you owe the bank $1,000, you've got a problem. If you owe the bank $1 billion, the bank has a problem, right? And so insofar as the bank in this analogy is a distributed network of value creating persons who are becoming prominent by creating value for humanity as a whole, well, they were the bank and they had a problem because the old aristocracy owed them many billions or many trillions at current dollar valuations of money. And we existed in a system before the existence of fiat currency and fractional reserve banking. So it seems not a coincidence to me that you run this cycle forward and then you have Europe destroyed in World War I, you have a recovery, then you have World War II, Europe destroyed again, nuclear weapons, and everybody switches away from hard currency to fractional reserve fiat currency pretty much en masse. You have things, you know, then evolving a couple more decades, and then you have the US pulling out of Bretton Woods. You have a whole series of economic events that lead to the 2008 recession, where again, we are running into the situation where we have a predatory elite whose strategy involves coordination of default risk. So there were a bunch of correlated risks in the mortgage-backed securities market that these people were aware of and that most people weren't. And they knew that the current structures of governance in the world, not just in the United States, would coordinate to bail them out at everyone else's expense. And so sure enough, how does that end up happening? There's always a new front of the conflict, which ends up as serving as a sort of distraction. This is part of the anti-mimetic field effect that I'm talking about here, whereby something more interesting happens, which causes the actual nature of what's going on to become boring and passé in comparison. And so the current front of this looks like things like a strong optimization for identity politics and a further and further atomization of identity into the point where now younger people seem to believe that everyone has a completely unique atomic identity that means that we can't in fact have intersubjectivity at all. We're all atomized and trapped in our own subjectivity, and this increasing focus on identity as definitional and as a source of conflict seems to be a part of the Cripsis strategy of the intersubjective parasite to prevent the creation of conscious intersubjectivity at all, which would allow us to notice the sort of harvesting dynamics of negentropy, which are the life cycle of these entities. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with this. I see you nodding, so if you have a follow-up, let me know, but that's basically what I got.
Yeah, this is exactly, it fits on the head. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Margaret, you had a question? Or no?
Can you remind me what it was?
Posted it in the chat.
Oh, thank you, Peter. Oh, it was just a throwaway of, Evan, at one point you kind of said something about impersonal processes being related and implicated in the cause of these dynamics that we're trying to map out. And I was just curious about what might become visible if we look at the dynamics in terms of choice. So that's one. And then I'll also just throw in, the lattice question, like that keeps coming to mind as we're talking about this. More and more I keep thinking about Peter Wang's mental model of relationships, and when he starts to talk about the lattice, both moving forward and fraying at another edge. And I'm just curious if you have any more to speak to in that regards.
So I'm going to make a pretty bold claim here and say that I think that the fact that we can perceive things personally, we can take things personally, my current best guess is that that itself might be the result of the evolution of parasites on intersubjectivity. So in other words, that it might in fact be the case that the very notion of a personal perspective, as opposed to noticing impersonal dynamics and participating in them through choice, is in fact a symptom of intersubjective parasitism. So like I said, that's a pretty bold claim. I don't think I have time left in this session to defend it, but that's kind of where I'm coming from, actually. So to compress that into a not quite accurate and much lower resolution way of saying it, the Buddhists might not really know why people aren't just awake naturally, right? And maybe they in fact are awake in the Buddhist sense naturally, but the reason that we seem to observe a population of mostly not awake people who are not awake because they take things personally in a way that you could describe as having to do with tanha might itself be the sort of canonical mainline first diagnostic symptom of intersubjective parasitism. It seems plausible to me that when you get human group evolution, maybe, up to 500,000 years ago or something like that, that there was not really such a thing as isolated subjectivity, that we probably emerged into conscious intersubjectivity as we emerged into consciousness. And so then this created a substrate for another ecosystem to evolve on top of it, just like the previous levels of substrate did. And then part of the feedback dynamics between this new level and what was the substrate, meaning human conscious intersubjectivity, created these isolation bubbles, these pockets of feeling alone that we call subjectivity as opposed to intersubjectivity. So that's kind of my take on that.
Okay.
And you had another question that I forgot.
Oh, I was just asking about the lattice network, if you wanted to expand on that at all. And then I'll just say in response. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, just in response to what you just shared, what's coming to mind is the pattern of movement that back in our meme podcast conversations, where we started tracking this almost like divergent, convergent waveform happening across meme plexes. I feel like that's what I'm hearing you describe around conscious intersubjectivity, taking things personally and not. And like, it has me wondering about where in kind of a larger wave pattern we might be finding ourselves.
Yeah, so that's a good way to answer that and the lattice question in a sideways way. I have a wild and crazy hypothesis. I'm not sure at all whether this is true or not, but something has an intuitive pull about it for me, at least, that that sort of pulsating wave pattern that you're talking about between subjectivity, intersubjectivity, this sort of dynamic running through our experience. Well, when you look, what else has pulsing patterns like that? Well, things like internal combustion engines. So, and to tie this back to Chris's question about the ways in which we might think of intentions and goals and personalities of these intersubjective parasites, it could be the case that a large part of the way our cultures and civilizations are arranged are essentially a fiendishly complicated internal combustion engine, where the driver of the power production is in the pulsing dynamism between atomization and intersubjectivity.
Do you think? Okay, so sorry, I'm going to pause in a second. But you talked about internal combustion, and I've been reading in different sources about this hypothesis around like our potential next mutation as a species being around mastering the dynamics of like internal versus external combustion, right? Of like, what does it look like to have internal implosion versus external explosion? And that often being characterized in the language of like the dichotomy between masculine and feminine perspectives. But if we take that as maybe being like too dualistic and its own potential outcropping of intersubjective agents, then I'm wondering what might be present in what you just pointed at of like combustion engines that are internally imploding versus external?
Yeah, so an internal combustion engine is far more efficient than an external combustion engine. The sort of canonical external combustion engine is the old school steam engine, right? Where you have combustion heating a fluid that then creates pressure, and then you use the pressure of the fluid to essentially sort of hydraulically drive pistons or whatever, versus creating the combustion inside the pistons themselves. And then this is a much more thermodynamically efficient process. And so the ability to sort of redirect the excess heat energy back into the engine system of internal combustion engines seems characteristic of the types of extreme pressure that individuals and societies seem to feel in their subjectivity and intersubjectivity in the present moment, right? Like, it feels to us, I think, like there are enormous stakes. Everything is under a lot of pressure. And so this seems like there might be some sort of hyper object walls around our societies, which serve a similar function to the walls of a piston to contain the explosion in an internal combustion engine, or even more crazily, the RDX lenses that focus the initial impulse for a critical nuclear reaction and that sort of situation. So again, it's all about redirecting the excess energy of the reaction back into the system so that the loop continues, basically. Like, what if samsara is not just a wheel, but a combustion cycle inside of an engine?
All right. Thank you, Margaret. So we'll gently close here. Evan, any parting words you'd like to leave us with today at the Stoa?
So I really appreciate all of the questions and shares and comments. This is super useful and good new information for me to incorporate into the taxonomy, the more complete taxonomy for next week. And I'm very grateful for the discussion, for everyone's attention, and it has been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, awesome session today. Awesome questions, everyone. We're here next week for the big reveal, taxonomy of parasites, or intersubjective entities, I should say. So Evan, everyone, thanks so much for coming to the Stoa today.